But one of her colleagues is laying here in what was a tomb. It's a collapsed tomb. It was over him at the time this was originally built. And under where he's laying is a storage area with a number of pots, pottery, various artifacts. And it was in the corner, as Barclay is indicating in the inset there, that this amazing find was made. Silver amulets that were rolled up, but they had inscriptions on them from the Bible. This is from Numbers chapter 6, verse 24. The Lord bless you and keep you, make the Lord make his face to shine upon you. The priestly blessing was what the priest wore around their neck. They inscribed this on the pieces of silver, rolled it up, and wore it as an amulet. This is from Jeremiah's time, clearly identified from the pottery as well as from other cultural implications, and really not even contested by the liberals. Well, how did they inscribe so well on silver? In fact, we found with infrared technology in the last 2 years much more than what they originally found. Numbers 6, 24, 25, and 26 were very obvious. As we developed more technology, reported in the New York Times, by the way, just 2 years ago, almost the whole chapter of the context is engraved on the back of it. How did they do that? I think we get a hint from Jeremiah 17, where we read, the sin of Judah is written down with an iron stylus with a diamond point. It is engraved on the tablet of their heart. Evidently, they were doing some engraving with diamonds at the end of an iron stylus. And so on this, you do have the text. Now, the significance we related to this morning when we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, the documentary hypothesis says these books that comprise the earliest books supposedly written by Moses, the early writers, weren't written then at all, but written after the captivity. And this is what the documentary hypothesis is supposed to have proved. And we found then some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were actual copies of the Paleo-Hebrew, which had to have been written prior to the exile, because that's the only time that style was used. Now, when they found the 300 BC copies, it wasn't from before the exile, but there were copies of what was before the exile. This was not a copy. This was written before the exile. This was 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it is precisely like the text that we have today. Identical. 2 renditions of it and almost a whole chapter on the back side. 400 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. That just says the people that have given their faith to the documentary hypothesis have made fools out of themselves as they tried to deny the Word of God. We move to Tel Dan. This is up at the northern end of Israel. We can see Mount Hermon in the background. This is the northern extremity of Israel, and there we find Dan. You remember when the kingdom split, and you got Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam took the 10 tribes to the north, and he set up at Dan and at Bethel altars to keep them from going back to Jerusalem. Well, even the Department of Antiquities now have recognized that they have found that altar at Dan, and they have their signs put up that commemorates Jeroboam's altar at Tel Dan. This is a picture of that restored. The metal part has been restored, but they have found with the utensils clear indications that that's what that is. This is Dr. Clifford Wilson, who was head of excavations at Gazer for a number of years, a very strong believer in the Word of God. The utensils that they found that were used by the priests to offer the sacrifices are now in the museum there in Jerusalem. This was one of 2 altars, you remember, at Dan and at Bethel. Well, the altar at Bethel was destroyed, wasn't it, by the curse. Remember the young prophet and the old prophet in that story, and he cursed the altar and it split. This one didn't. and this one we have found. On the southern side of the city of Dan, that has been excavated over a number of years, we see the gate to the city. In a number of places in the Old Testament, you read that they sat at the gates, and this is where judgment was rendered. You remember Job sat at the gates of the city, and others had judgment rendered there. This is a scene that gives insight into that. Here's where the judge sat, the elders sat beside him. Now these wooden poles, of course, have been restored, but they fit into the sockets that were there, and they were for the wooden poles, and look just like this. Just outside that gate, another excavation took place in 1993. Now, here's where the gate was that we just looked at. Just outside, an inscription that formed a stele. This is an upright stone with writing on it commemorating some historical event, typically. Was found in 1993 by an official providence dig. One of the objections the archaeological people make if you find something that they don't like, well, it's not a providence dig. It wasn't under the authority of the Department of Antiquities. And most of the great finds, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, weren't found in that manner. But this was by one of the leading archaeologists in Israel, a providence dig under the auspices of the Department of Antiquities. And it describes a battle between Hazael, king of Aram, and the kings of Judah and Israel. Again, this was written by the enemies, by the one who actually defeated Israel, and basically it's saying, I just whooped them bad. You know, I destroyed the house of David. Now, one of the statements that you find commonly in the standard textbooks is there's no reference to David, there's no archaeological evidence for this great kingdom, and we'll see some of that in a minute. And it's not so. And here is absolute proof that there was a house of David, that this claim that they never existed is just dishonest, because it has been archaeologically confirmed, again, by the enemies of God. I've been one of the area supervisors at the City of David now for about 4 years, and working with some very brave men. The City of David, we often think, refers to Bethlehem, and there is a sense in which that can be called the City of David, but that's a term that was used by David to refer to the city that he conquered from the Jebusites, that was Jerusalem. 1 Samuel 5 tells us the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. The inhabitants of the land, they said to David, you'll not come in here, but the blind, the lame will turn you away, thinking David cannot enter here. It was a highly fortified city. This is long after they conquered the land, took possession of it, lived in it. This is about the last thing that was done. Back all the way to David's time, this was a strong fortification that hadn't been conquered. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. And we continue to read how that happened. Verse 8, David said on that day, whoever climbs up by the way of the water shaft and defeats the Jebusites, the lame, blind, hated by David, so he shall be chief and captain. So, as we read the story, we find that Joab was one who was brave enough to go up the water shaft and got inside the city, opened the gates and said, okay, fellas, come on in. And they marched in and took the city. Verse 9 says, so David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built all around from the Milo inward. This Milo, we didn't know what that was. I think we've got a pretty good idea at this point. David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. And then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. Okay, here's this great king with these great monuments that were built, monumental buildings, and he became greater and greater. Where's the evidence? Well, there's sort of a catch-22 here. What happened? The Babylonians came in and destroyed it, didn't they? And what happens to cedar when you set fire to it, it burns. And if you were to find this house of David, built of cedar and, of course, stone as well, then you'd know the story was false. But you don't find it. They say, well, see, it's false. But you should find evidence and foundations and indications that it was there, and indeed we do. But let's look at some historical background to the contest here over the city of David, and begin with Kathleen Kenyon again. She was, of course, from Oxford and is noted for modernized archaeology in Israel. That means she got people to disbelieve the Bible. She worked in Jericho from 52 to 58, as we've indicated, and spent time then, after she finished in Jericho, at the city of David from 61 to 68. And here is her conclusion. It may seem disappointing that the excavation